It can be a TV program. It can be anything. When I said football, you wouldn't believe it. Yeah. What? Cold season's about over anyway. But it can be anything that gets between you and God. The idea of this is to start to build new habits, to start learning or start to realize the time that you're taking away from God by letting the world get involved in your life. So I hope everybody has figured out what they're doing. If not, pray about it. We've still got a few days before it happens. And I'll give you a heads up. I told Kenny this morning, it was funny, I listened to Levi Lusko give a sermon on this, and he started off with, this is rated M for mature. Anybody with children, I'm sorry, you may have to answer some questions after this. But we're going to talk about Tamar, which is in Genesis chapter 38. So Tamar is the first woman mentioned by name in the genealogy. And the thing about the genealogy is that back in those days, the men were the only ones given credit for the genealogy. All they worried about was the male descendants throughout the Bible, but God must have laid it on Matthew's heart to make sure that he mentioned women like Tamar. Because there's only 5 women that he mentions, I think 4 women by name, and then of course Mary. But so Tamar must have some valuable lessons to teach us. And I've studied this, I've read through it, and it's going to be a challenge, but I'm excited about it. So we'll start Genesis 38, verse 1. About this time Judah left home and moved to Adullam, where he stayed with a man named Hiram. There he saw a Canaanite woman, the daughter of Shua, and he married her. When he slept with her, she became pregnant and gave birth to a son, and he named the boy Okay. Judah. Everybody recognizes the name, right? Judah is where Jesus, he's direct descendants, because Jesus is called the Lion of Judah. But he went to he went and he saw a Canaanite woman that he liked. Remember what happened last week when Jacob picked the woman he liked. Sometimes it's not important what we like. Sometimes what we like can actually create more problems than they can fix. He picked a woman he liked. If you look back, Abraham picked his wife for Jacob, and they were very particular about where these women came from, their beliefs and everything. But once the men started picking what they liked instead of what they needed, they started picking the wrong women. Because you think about it, what was one thing God said? Don't marry Canaanites. And what did he do? He found a Canaanite woman that he liked. She was attractive. Sometimes we think with the wrong motives. Sometimes we think without actually thinking what's best for us. But she gave birth to a son, named him Well, that's a biblical name. But as we go on, we're going to find out that when people of belief get with people of unbelief, guess what happens? The people with belief start relaxing on their beliefs. They start not having as much faith. Then she became pregnant again and gave birth to another son, and she named him Onan. And when she gave birth to a third son, she named him Shelah. At that time of Shelah's birth, they were living in Kazib. Okay, like I said, the first one, was a biblical name, but the next 2 are not biblical names. In the course of time, Judah arranged for his firstborn son, to marry a young woman named Tamar. Okay. Judah is picking out a wife for his son, which was normal custom back then, but who picked Judah's wife out? He did. And he realized that, wow, this just ain't working the way we'd hoped. So now he's wanting to step back in and be a father of biblical belief or religious belief. But the problem was, in verse 7 we read, but was a wicked man in the Lord's sight, so the Lord took his life. Think about it. I'm thankful that God didn't look at my life that closely because I'd been gone a long time ago. And I'm sure a few of us can relate to that. But back in those days, when the husband died and they didn't have a child, then it was, they call it the Levirate law or Levirate law, is where the second born goes and marries a woman and has a child, and the first son is basically takes the place of his father. So if Onan went and he married Tamar and they had a child, a son, Onan would be given up 1/3 of, well actually, yeah, he would be given up 1/3 of his, sorry, I went blank. He would have given up 1/3 of his birthright. He would have given up 1/3 of what he would inherit from his father. Because the oldest son got 2/3, the second one and the third one each got 1/3. Or whatever the math comes out. But it gets real confusing because if he would have had a son with her, he would have given up part of his inheritance. And who in the right mind wants to give up their inheritance? Then Judah said to her brother Onan, go and marry Tamar as her law requires of the brother of a man who has died. You must produce an heir for your brother. But Onan was not willing to have a child who would not be his own heir. So whenever he had intercourse with his brother's wife, he spilled the semen on the ground. This prevented her from having a child who had belonged to his brother. But the Lord considered it evil for Onan to deny a child of his dead brother. So the Lord took Onan's life too. Onan didn't want to give up his rights. He didn't want to give up what he felt that he deserved. We ever wanted that? Have we ever felt like we deserve something and we're not going to give it up no matter what? No matter what the cost, we're going to keep what we deserve. And then we got to look at it another way. How many of us have ever felt like we've been ripped off? Like we've been shorted by someone? Been cheated? Felt like that someone took advantage of us? Didn't give us what we deserved? See, the thing of it is, we read the Bible and we find out that these people were dealing with the same problems we deal with today. These people were dealing with the same issues we deal with today. I was reading this morning and it was talking about the end times in my devotional. And we read the Bible and we find out that they dealt with the same problems we did. Actually, they had more problems than we did. Because at the birth of the church, Satan was on attack because he wanted to stop it. Well, let's face it. God had 12 brothers to choose which brother to take. Which one's going to carry his line? And as we read the Bible, we think, man, Joseph's got to be the one. Joseph's got to be it. We read chapter 37, and it talks about Joseph and getting thrown in the pit and getting sold into slavery. And we think, he's the guy. He's the guy that's going to bring the Lord. He's going to be the line that it comes through. But then all of a sudden, in verse 38, we're reading about Judah. And then guess what? 39 to 53, I think it is, we read again about Joseph. So Judah was just sort of shoved in here right at the beginning. And when we look at it, you'd think, well, why in the world would But see, God didn't use the one that everybody thought. God didn't use the one that everybody believed, because God wanted to make sure that when we look at this, we see that God can use anybody He wants. He can use anybody, even though they were living through it, they didn't see it, but God already knew what He wanted. He already knew which way He was going. He already knew who His heir was going to come from. And He picked Judah. Guy that picked his own wife because he just liked the way she looked. She looked good when he walked into the party. He was proud of her. But she wasn't what he needed. And then he had 2 sons. And now they're dead. Now we know that the seed comes through Judah, but he's only got 1 son left. And I'm sorry, but if you think about it, Tamar's married 2 boys. 2 boys are dead. Judah didn't want to give up his son. He didn't want to give up his only heir left alive. Because the thing of it is, you needed a son to take care of you, because a woman by herself would have to turn to prostitution or something like that to be able to provide a living for herself. But if she had a son, he could take care of her when she got older. She could take care of him, or he could take care of her later on in life. He could take care of her even where she is at that point. Because, like I said, the world back then was based around men. Everything was, the jobs were for men, they weren't for women. So anyway, in verse 11 it says, Then Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, Go back to your parents' home and remain a widow until my son Shelah is old enough to marry you. But Judah didn't really intend to do this, because he was afraid Shelah would also die like his 2 brothers. So Tamar went back to live in her father's home. Can you imagine how embarrassed she was? She's been married twice and still don't have a child. She's an embarrassment to her family. She's an outcast. Even though she's part of the family, we got to remember earlier in Genesis, what was one of the punishments? Or not punishment, but when a man and a woman get together, they leave their father and mother. So she's left her father and mother, and now she's coming back. And now her dad's going, Well, why haven't you had a kid? Why are you still barren? Why aren't you married to the 3rd son? It's sort of like living with my son. Why? And she's got to keep answering these questions. Plus, she has to wear widow's clothes. So even if a man does find her attractive, he can't go near her or go to her, because he can see that she's wearing a widow's clothes. That means she's in mourning. They can't approach her. They can't ask her out on a date, because back then it wasn't that simple. See, as we read the Bible, we got to remember what part of the Bible we're in. We got to remember what the customs were. We got to remember what the people's thought process was. Because when we read the Bible and we think in our thought process, some of the things we read, it's like, what? Why would they do that? But we got to get ourselves basically in the thought process of going back in time to think like they could, to believe what they believe. The only way we can do that is read the Bible. The only way we can do that is study. The only way we can do that is go to other resources. I mean, we got the internet now, and it makes things so much easier to find. I can remember back looking in the old encyclopedias, and I'm sure Peyton and Kinley, when they get older, they're going to be going, encyclo what? I can remember having to look up words in the dictionary because we didn't have spell check. Man, wouldn't that have helped on some of the spelling tests we had? I can remember back when we couldn't even use a calculator to do math. And now these kids don't know how to do calculations without math. So things have changed. But, see, our kids would have to understand what we lived in, to understand the struggles we had. And that's what we gotta do with further back in biblical times. We gotta understand the lives they lived. It wasn't like they could look up on the internet or Christian.com or whatever, Farmer.com or some of those other dating apps. They didn't have that. So you had to marry people, you know, your family wanted to know the person, so that's why a lot of relatives got married to other relatives. It wasn't like that you had social gatherings every week or monthly. You basically knew your family and you worked your area. Some years later, Judah's wife died. After the time of mourning was over, Judah and his friend Hira, the Adulamite, went to Timnah to supervise the shearing of his sheep. Okay. This one I didn't understand till I got to looking and studying this. Shearing of sheep. Okay. Shearing the sheep wasn't that he was worried about how the guys were going to shear the sheep. Shearing